You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your authoritarian host, Abraham.
And I am your didn't do anything wrong, but I'm in jail anyway host, Shane.
We are a psychology podcast, and we talk about the things that humans do and the things that they think and the things that they emit, I guess. And that's our show.
Yeah, it's a fun show. So today we're talking about political prisoners, which I can't remember exactly how this topic came up, but it's one of the more interesting ones, I think, because I don't know that people really understand what a political prisoner is. And there's a lot of motivations for why people do this type of thing, why people arrest people for having opposing views.
And if you end up liking what you hear today, or you've heard us in the past, and you've really decided that this is your jam, awesome. Glad to have you. You can support us further if you would like by leaving us a rating or review, joining us on Patreon, picking up some merch, sending us a donation, taking out a billboard with our name on it in your local area.
That would be
cool.
Or
anything of that nature. I'll talk about more at the end of this. And this episode is coming out on September 21st. And September 21st has many notable holidays. One thing I'll point out is that the month of September by itself is also National Piano Month, Sepsis Awareness Month, National Ovarian Cancer Awareness Month, and hey, it is Happy Cat Month.
Oh, so many things.
Yeah, it's a lot going on.
September's a busy month. I feel like there's a lot going on in September.
There's a lot. And I don't recall, I may have said some of those in the past. I'm sorry if I did. But as far as September 21st, there are some holidays, if you will, that are specific to September 21st. First of all, this is very important. September 21st is National Pecan Cookie Day.
Pecan or pecan?
Well, I think if you're in the West, it's pecan. Is pecan how you say it down there?
So Dolly Parton will say it is pecan because a pecan is something you pee in.
Oh, okay.
But I talked to a pecan farmer and he said it's pecan.
Well, maybe he pees in a can.
I don't know. I can't keep up. Its language is weird.
It is also World Gratitude Day, National Miniature Golf Day.
Yes.
Escapeology Day.
Okay.
International Day of Peace. Someone tell that to Vladimir Putin, please.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Send the memo.
Speaking of Vladimir Putin, it is also World Alzheimer's Day.
Nice. That's a good dig. I'm actually glad that it's National Mini Golf Day because I do appreciate a good game of mini golf.
Right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Good pastime.
Yes, agreed.
But we're not actually talking about any of those things. Instead, as you mentioned, we are talking about political prisoners. And as in most of the things that we decide to do, we should define our terms.
Yeah. So a political prisoner is going to be a person that is imprisoned for their political beliefs or actions. And this is going to be really important when we talk about the insurrection later. That's a point of contention about that specific January 6th event.
We are going there. It's happening.
Yep. Spoiler alerts.
There's also a related concept called the prisoner of conscience. And this is a person imprisoned for expression of their political, religious, or other contentiously held beliefs. Mm-hmm. So similar sort of idea, but maybe not necessarily something they've done, just something they've expressed thinking or believing.
And again, we'll go over examples of that if that's not quite clear too. So currently, there are estimates that indicate that there are more than 1 million political prisoners globally. And that's in places where maybe there's a totalitarian type of government or an authoritarian government, which has banned certain beliefs, certain outspoken practices against the government, or maybe certain religious practices and whatnot. So there are more than 1 million, at least current estimates, of political prisoners globally.
Yeah, almost all of them are in Russia or Afghanistan.
I'm sure.
I'm kidding. Don't actually know if that's the case. Just throwing shade at the people who are out there doing the authoritarian thing, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
There are, unfortunately, no universally accepted criterion for how someone might become a political prisoner, which kind of does make sense because oftentimes it's at the whim of some non-democratically installed regime. Mm-hmm. And so the context in which someone is arrested for their beliefs may vary based on the views of the current government or regime, the systems they're in that are in place at the time that the action or the beliefs are expressed or take place.
Yeah, so this is going to be highly contextual and you'll see that as we go forward. So Amnesty International actually provides some basic criterion for what might make someone a political prisoner. First, the person is accused or convicted of a crime carried out for political motives. Second, the person is accused or convicted of a crime in a political context. Or third, a member or suspected member of an armed opposition group who has been charged with treason or subversion. Now, that gets a little bit dicey because treason and subversion and all that stuff, that may depend on the political context and what that unique government considers treason. But these are kind of the general ideas of why somebody might be considered a political prisoner in different places.
Yeah, I mean, like in Turkey, it might be treason to say we don't like this current government system. Mm-hmm. And just that combination of words might be considered quote unquote treason. So it is all in how it's defined, and it's usually going to be defined on a sort of place by place, situation by situation basis, particularly again in non-democratically installed regimes for whatever they are.
Yep, absolutely.
And going back to one you said is just to be clear, for a person convicted of committing a crime where the motive for that crime was political, I believe is what that means. Yeah. And then the other thing here I think is useful for pointing out is we're not actually taking a stance on whether having political prisoners is in and of itself a good or bad thing, or I guess just saying that like it happens for various reasons and we're just sort of talking through what it is. Yeah,
absolutely. And you'll see too, some of the examples were really poor reasons for somebody to be imprisoned in the ways they were. But for the most part, what you'll find is political prisoners are neither a good nor bad thing. That's not what we're getting at here. But what you'll find is most often it leans towards that bad situation.
Yeah, exactly. Because I can definitely see there being circumstances where someone being a political prisoner is a better situation for them to be a prisoner than not. I think people who have done very extreme things for political motives, where those things were violent and caused a lot of harm and dangerous, it might make sense for them then to be imprisoned.
Right.
But also, as you said, a lot of the time these happen simply because they're doesn't look as nice to their government and something of that nature.
Right. And that's honestly that's where the prisoner of conscience issue comes in. So folks who are considered prisoners of conscience are typically people who are imprisoned for their beliefs, not actually actions. That becomes a more significant problem.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. PACE, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. There's so many free words they got in there to make that acronym. That's cheating.
Yeah. Boo. Boo PACE. Actually, no, it's fine.
Yeah, don't boo PACE. They provide an outline for criterion for determining whether someone is a political prisoner. So they sort of have their own thing here. Mm-hmm. And that includes the detention/arrest violates basic guarantees of human rights, laws, and regulations, specifically freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, freedom of expression and information, and freedom of assembly and association. So for someone who is detained for those reasons, they would be considered a political prisoner.
Yeah, another reason might be the detention itself is imposed for purely political reasons. That would be the equivalent of like, oh, you and I disagree politically, you're going to jail. And that's the only reason. They haven't committed a crime, they haven't done anything, they just simply disagree with you.
Right. That the length or conditions of the detention are out of proportion with the offense. So like you said something bad about your government and you get put away for 15 years type of thing.
Yeah, we'll see that with Martin Luther King specifically later. And the detention is a result of unfair or politically motivated judicial proceedings. So essentially, the person is detained and they are sentenced, but the proceedings themselves are more like a kangaroo court. They're very unfair, they're very unjust, and there's no fair trial to be had for that person.
Yeah, you might imagine a situation where a dictator installs some loyalist judge, and then when that dictator is out of power and brought to court for their crimes, then the judge that they installed is overseeing the case. That could seem like a pretty severe conflict of interest.
Agreed. Yeah. Weird, huh?
Yeah. Just as food for thought.
Just an example, just a hypothetical.
That's probably relevant somewhere. I don't know it anywhere immediately offhand.
Yeah, just a thought. It's a thought experiment, you know?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now, all of us might seem a little bit fuzzy, and that's fair because it's very difficult to pin down exactly what might make somebody a political prisoner because those contexts are all very different. The Human Rights Center Memorial actually wrote a nice piece about how we need to refine these definitions, but updates to the PACE guidelines that we just talked about have yet to be made at the time of this writing and recording. It's very likely that they will be. It's very likely those are being discussed, but they haven't been done yet.
Other organizations, such as the Assistance Association for Political Prisoners and the Congressional Executive Commission on China, more fun acronyms, each provide definitions and examples of what constitutes a political prisoner. So again, it depends on where you're at that we're going to see different descriptions and definitions of what constitutes a political prisoner.
So a brief recap of kind of where we're at. A political prisoner is someone who is arrested or detained based on a belief or action within a political context. And so that's really where we find a lot of those political prisoners is they are arrested or detained unjustly based on a thought, a belief, and very few times is it a violent action.
Yes. So why does this happen? And how does this happen? But why, Shane?
So there's a lot of reasons, actually. And again, it comes back to context, right? Every government that has people installed in power, every dictator, every authoritarian typically has their own agenda.
Yep.
What we might find is that those agendas are going to lead to detentions and arrests. For example, so what we might define here in the United States as free speech may be defined as a crime in more restrictive context. So those outspoken against Nazis during World War II era Germany were imprisoned and put to death consistently simply for sharing a different political ideology. So for example, the Antifa logo, which was designed to be graffiti to cover up the swastikas that were going around, that was an example of people who would get arrested for a political ideology and put to death. So painting over a Nazi symbol was enough to get you killed. And that is an example of how detention and the handing down of a punishment might be a type of political imprisonment.
Yeah. So in most cases, outspoken activists might be jailed by dictatorships or specifically to quell a resistance group. And so the political prisoners might be made up of sort of a quote unquote grievance population or groups of people who are oppressed by the people who are specifically in power. And so then what you might have happen here is they sort of become symbolic or representative of the opposition to the authoritarian regime that is controlling the narrative and the government.
Yeah, and they'll be made examples of. And so it's like, oh, if you're going to stand up, here's what's going to happen. What they do, taking and imprisoning a leader or a spokesperson for that grievance population, it's the example. It's the example of the resistance to back off. Don't do this because this is what will happen. Taking a prisoner from the opposition tells the group, here's what will happen if you keep it up. Here's the torture. Here's the imprisonment. You will go away forever if you keep doing what you're doing. So pay attention to what's happening to this person so that you don't end up in this space too. Trust the state, trust the government, trust us. And that's kind of how we end up in these spaces.
Yeah, this is a scare them straight sort of tactic. It's fear as the motivator for compliance is sort of the thing.
Yeah.
So all the things that we generally appreciate and want to have around us as part of our normal day to day, that sort of stuff,
Right, for sure.
That's the dry sarcasm right there.
It's so dry. I had to take a sip of water from that.
That's right. Everyone listening is going to need a little bit of water after the dust bowl that you just heard. Okay. So how do we get to this place of political prisoners? It's obviously going to be varied, but the government that typically holds political prisoners may have established unnecessarily restrictive laws and label crimes that are committed as treason or sedition, almost regardless of what they are sometimes. And this is often simply for acting out or for speaking out, simple demonstrations. And this comes with a heavy punishment from the oppressing government. This is actually why it's very, very important that something like flag burning is considered free speech and political speech, because you have to imagine, so people say things like, well, if you burn our flag, you should go to prison. I'm like, I want you to imagine living in a country where that's the case, where simply burning a piece of material will land you in prison. And that's the country that you're calling free?
Right.
Like, that's not free. We have to fight for the rights of people to disagree with us if we want freedom of expression in a country. And if you don't want freedom of expression in a country, country, then you don't want a free country. And that might be where you're at, but like you can't have your cake and eat it too in that situation.
That's an excellent point. I'm so glad you brought that up because there are so many people that get so upset about that because of the disrespect that comes along with that. But the truth is that if we lived in a country where flag burning was an actual crime and people did go to jail for lengthy periods of time for burning a piece of material, then we're going to have a significant issue. Like that's a coercive state that we're in, and then that's not good for anybody.
Yeah. The communist and the dictator countries that do exist, that is a crime in many of them.
Yeah.
And that is something that is punishable by going to prison. So essentially, you're sort of like casting your lot with them if you feel like that should be a crime. Yep. The communists and dictators are where you want to be.
Yep, exactly.
All right. Well, we should talk about some famous cases. But first, Shane, knock, knock.
Who's there?
Interrupting cow.
Interrupting cow who?
Okay, we are back. Let's talk about some famous cases of political prisoners.
Right, and hopefully these will illustrate a little bit about kind of what these circumstances look like for folks.
You can buy them by the case now at Costco.
Ha! So many political prisoners there. Now, instead of talking about a general timeline for what happens to political prisoners, we thought it'd be best to highlight some folks who have been identified as political prisoners and their unique stories. But please note, all of these folks deserve their own books, their shows, etc., 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 to cover the breadth of their work and their struggle. These are really famous cases, and there's plenty of documentaries and stuff about these folks. We're not going to be able to do them the justice they deserve by kind of going through these bullet points, but what we're trying to do is we hope that by giving them some spotlight in this case, you might get curious, spend some time researching their causes, researching their life stories, because it's going to be far more interesting than the 3 or 4 bullet points that we have for each person.
At the very least, you might do a little bit better at your next trivia night. And, also, I think generally bringing awareness to this is a useful thing. Even if you don't necessarily remember all the details, you have learned something, you are somewhat improved moving forward.
Exactly. 100%.
That is our show's motto.
Yeah, just make the world a little bit better than it was the day before and also do better at trivia.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's it. We nailed it. And that'll be on our next shirt.
Yep. I can't wait. So the first person that we're going to talk about is Aung San Suu Kyi. I am sure that I butchered that because my mouth is just a jumbled mess.
I appreciate you taking that on because I was looking at it thinking I don't want to do this wrong, and then you just jumped right in there and saved me. So
I try, Abraham. I try. She is a Burmese politician and Nobel Peace Prize winner for her work in bringing democratic practices to Myanmar throughout the 80s and all the way through the 2010s. She worked closely with the National League of Democracy of NLD, and she played a large part in the 8888 uprising, which was a series of protests, marches, and riots that led to thousands of deaths during that time.
It sounds like it could be the name of a comic, though.
Mm-hmm.
The 8888
uprising. Yeah, it occurred on August 8th, 1988. It's like when it all came to a head. That's why it's the 8888. Mm-hmm.
I like that. Okay, yeah. Cool. So Aung San Suu Kyi became a national figure during these protests and helped the National League of Democracy, the NLD, secure 81% of the parliament seats during the 1990 election. And so when the regime at the time refused to transfer power and nullified the election instead, that sounds familiar.
Sounds really, really familiar.
She was placed under house arrest where she remained for nearly 15 years. So there's this practice of refusing to transfer power and nullifying the results of an election. Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway.
Yeah.
Moving on.
I wonder if any other examples will come up of that. During this time, she actually survived a 2003 assassination attempt, and many activists would make a pilgrimage to her home as part of the nonviolent strategies of protest that were used against the military-backed government. So they would go and visit, and they would make pilgrimages very much. And that was actually a really important part of the outgoing protest against that current regime. Eventually, what ended up happening was her political party persisted in the elections, even though the regime was not giving up power. The political party won, and her house arrest was lifted, and she was able to become an elected official as a state councilor of Myanmar. So she is now, or she was at least for up until 2016 and 17, she was an active politician in the government that she helped kind of turn around and get rid of the regime that was the more oppressive oppressive regime. But the more important thing is, because she was an active politician and an activist trying to get the NLD to win the election, and they won, she was placed on house arrest. She could not leave her house for 15 years. That's unjust.
Yeah, just for working to install a democracy in her country.
Yeah. So if that's not a clear example, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I'd say that definitely meets the definition pretty clearly.
Yeah.
The Philippines, unfortunately, were not so lucky and have essentially done the reverse with their 2022 election. So
yeah.
Sorry for you guys. Another very famous political prisoner is Nelson Mandela. So many people have probably heard this name. You know, he's been gone for a few years now, I think. So it's useful, I think, to just revisit this and talk about it. But Mandela was one of the more famous examples of political prisoners. He was outspoken against apartheid, a system of racial segregation in South Africa that was in place from 1948 all the way through the 1990s. Mm-hmm. Not unlike, the United States, except ours didn't end.
Yeah.
And if you want to become...
just drop that right in, huh?
You gotta take your digs where you can. But if you want some more interesting insight on how dangerous this was, Trevor Noah actually has an interesting book on this called Born a Crime, and his family could have been put to death due to his mere existence under that regime. So some cool resource there.
Yeah, it's just an interesting insight. The book is not about apartheid, but it tells stories about growing up there and how dangerous it was for him and his family. So now, as an activist, Mandela was regularly demonstrating against the restrictive laws at the time. And so he was eventually arrested in 1962, which led to the Rivonia trial. And he was charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government and was sentenced to life in prison. So they found stuff on him. He was tried and he spent life in prison. So, which is, pretty severe for having not committed a crime. He did not commit a crime.
Right. That is another strategy, is just simply lob crimes at someone. They don't usually try and present evidence. They just say that it happened. They're like, oh, we have evidence. And they're like, show us the evidence. They're like, we can't because it's secret.
Yeah.
But he didn't commit any crimes, spent 3 decades in prison before he was released in 1990, which was around the end of apartheid.
Or was he? If you go back to our episode on the Mandela effect, or was he? Didn't he die in prison? We don't know. He didn't die in prison. He was released in 1990.
Yeah, they're conspiracy theories. And also, people just misremembering it, which was the Mandela effect. They were like, oh, I thought he died in prison. Uh-huh. Nope. He came out of prison, and photos of Mandela had not been shown to the public for nearly 20 years. So he, came out an old man. Surprise.
Yeah.
But many thought he passed away in prison. And so that's the Mandela effect, is essentially people en masse sort of misremembering something, and then that taking on a sort of cultural hold of everyone.
Yeah. And now after his release, he would go on to continue demonstrating and advocating for change in South Africa, and eventually became the first democratically elected president of South Africa in 1994. So the man did a lot of really, if it were me, if I were in prison for 30 years, I don't know that I would come out and want to be part of that government.
True.
So good on him for wanting to continue to change, and the resilience and grit that man had to do that is pretty impressive. So, I can't speak for what his presidency was like and all that, so I'm not going that far, but I do think it's important to recognize that he was absolutely a political prisoner and then still went forth to do some change in South Africa.
And so he did pass away. He died in 2013. Mm-hmm. I thought it was only a few years ago, almost 10 years ago now.
Yeah.
That surprises me.
It's wild.
So, whoops. So RIP to Nelson Mandela. Speaking of RIPs, our next political prisoner is Martin Luther King Jr. For those of you who don't know or just would like to revisit this, Martin Luther King Jr. was an activist in the United States throughout the 1950s and 60s. Many folks are familiar with the I Have a Dream portion of one of his speeches and his many demonstrations during the civil rights movement. So largely recognized in the United States as a figure leading the way for civil rights for people with darker complexions.
Yes. So during this time, he participated and organized in multiple demonstrations and survived a knife attack in 1958, though he would later be assassinated, unfortunately. But in particular, during a specific sit-in, he was arrested and eventually sentenced to 4 months of hard labor at a maximum security prison, state prison, as a result of just doing a sit-in. So basically, active protest, which is protected by the Constitution, a peaceful assembly, and he was sentenced to 4 months of hard labor at a maximum security state prison.
It was just a few decades ago. This is within the lifetime of many of our parents.
Yes.
So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, not even grandparents, our parents.
Right. That was a thing that could happen and might happen again. We're trending that way.
It probably still does happen.
That's true. That's a good point. It probably does. King was routinely arrested during his time. He was arrested at least 29 times for mostly things like protests, sit-ins, and demonstrations. I mean, he generally almost exclusively advocated nonviolent strategies. And I think there were times he got particularly scared and frustrated where he sort of seemed like he was waffling on this, but the totality of his messages were pretty consistently nonviolent strategies. And yet he was arrested nearly 30 times for that approach.
Absolutely. So again, context, right? Context matters. During the civil rights movement, segregation is a thing. He's getting arrested for protesting. That would technically qualify him as a political prisoner during those times, especially when he was imprisoned.
Makes sense.
Another example that we want that's actually a really recent example is luijainal-hathloul. So al-Hathloul is a women's rights activist best known for actively defying women driving restrictions in Saudi Arabia. And she was arrested in May of 2018. So again, very recent. May of 2018 for defying the ban and was eventually charged with, quote, attempting to destabilize the kingdom, end quote.
Oh my God, I want that on a shirt. That is so good. So, attempting to destabilize the kingdom. That would make that's a really good one. Like a sticker, maybe? I don't know.
I was going to say, how badass is that? Like, I mean, could you imagine, like, okay, you got out of prison. What'd you go to prison for? Attempting to destabilize the kingdom? Like,
right. Way to glorify your prisoner.
Yeah, I mean, and to me, that's a really easy way to martyrdom. Like, that person sounds like I would follow that person through the fires of hell. Like, that rules. Yeah. So.
Oh, she's rock and roll. I love this. She's hardcore.
She really is. Of the people that we're talking about, she's one of the most hardcore people. So strap in, because this is a wild ride.
Well, yeah. So let's get into this, because prior to her arrest, she was actually kidnapped from the UAE and deported back to Saudi Arabia. And of course, while she was there, she was detained and placed on a travel ban. And while under arrest, of course, women were granted the right to drive, though she was still not released. So this is sort of like people who were convicted of crimes related to like marijuana who are still in jail, even though in states where marijuana has since become legal. Yeah,
exactly. Which is just ridiculous. Now, while she was detained, she was tortured by being shocked, whipped, and having her feet beaten. And this all occurred in a location called, quote, the hotel, where others were tortured as well. And to note, this was before her trial took place. So she was beaten and tortured before she ever went to trial.
Yeah, while she's at Trump Tower, this was taking place.
Honestly, you're not far off. You're not far off.
In March 2019, her trial took place, although her charges were not clarified, and of course, reporters were not allowed to attend. The hearing was eventually postponed without reason or notice, resulting in further detainment, as you might imagine, and continued to be postponed indefinitely as of May 2020 due to COVID-19, per the reports. So spent obviously all this time imprisoned and not having a trial or anything. Not that, I mean, I think I would be suspect of the trial she would be allowed to receive anyway.
Right.
But yeah, that, and all of this, as we said, just for driving a car.
Yeah, seriously. So now in October of 2020, she actually began a hunger strike as a nonviolent protest against her conditions and imprisonment, which is super effective in some places, but also you have to be careful because those places will force feed you, which is a whole different thing. Now, this continued for weeks while global outcries for her release continued, and she was not released until March of 2021. Okay, so 2018 to 2021, she was imprisoned without a trial for driving. She had been sentenced to 5 years and 8 months in prison. She didn't complete that, obviously. So 5 years and 8 months for, again, wanting to drive or to destabilize the kingdom. Okay.
That's right.
Now, she is still currently on a travel ban, but here's going to be a weird little twist in this story.
As of 2021, she and several other activists that were arrested with her are suing the U.S. intelligence officers. And why might they be able to do that? Apparently, because they provided aid to the UAE to hack her electronic devices, and in so doing, allowed her to be kidnapped and deported and subsequently imprisoned. So
Could you imagine the United States doing something so shady?
Man, and I mean, how could that have happened? That was in 2018?
Weird. What was going on then?
Yeah.
Who was in charge then? We should have a conversation about that.
We should. We do have more political prisoners to talk about. Unfortunately, we have to let them cool their heels in prison a little bit longer as we let the capitalist system take its chunk of your time. Now, we've been talking about these political prisoners. We have so far covered a bunch of people whose names I'm going to butcher, but I'm going to try anyway. Aung San Suu Kyi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., luijainal-hathloul. And so that's who we've talked about so far, and we have a few more to cover. So who we got next, Shane?
Next, we've got Mahatma Gandhi, another very famous example of a political prisoner and well known for his active nonviolent protests, despite kind of his, we'll avoid talking about his personal life, but he is actually well known for his political imprisonment and his history is well documented. So we're going to keep this as brief as possible. There's plenty of movies. Sir Ben Kingsley does a great job portraying him. There's plenty of books. Go read them. But yeah, we'll keep this brief.
Yeah, as we said, there's controversy around him. The point for using him in this discussion is to talk about the political prisoner aspect. And so for him, using a variety of nonviolent strategies, including things like disruptive practices, such as independent resource production, hunger strikes. What a terrorist, you know?
Right.
He was a major figure in the movement to eventually gain India's independence.
So during his time, he was arrested and imprisoned a total of 13 times for various grievances, including not having his passport in South Africa, non-compliance during protest events, and violating the salt law. So the salt law essentially was this. The British at the time had total control of the collection and manufacture of salt, and demonstrators along with Gandhi would grab handfuls of salt along their march, like any of their marches, which was actually technically considered producing salt under the kingdom. It was a violation of the salt law. So even just reaching down, picking up handfuls of salt, that was enough to get people arrested.
Yep.
Wild.
All right. We've talked about them recently, but another set of political prisoners was a band of prisoners.
Yes.
Called Pussy Riot.
Yes. Great name for a band, by the way.
Yeah. As we mentioned previously, and we'll say again here, they were based out of Moscow, Russia, and many of their performances were considered unauthorized guerrilla gigs, if you will, in public areas that were often done as a means of protest specifically. So they were kind of trying to be loud and obnoxious and in your face. They weren't violent, but they were trying to be disruptive because they were protesting things about their government.
Yeah. So on March 3rd, 2012, members of the group were charged with hooliganism. That's actually pretty good. Pretty great term.
Yeah.
Hooliganism after a performance inside Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior. They were denied bail and were eventually charged with hooliganism motivated by religious hatred. Okay, so going back to the definition of political prisoners and the prisoners of consciousness, like that's an example of that, right? So hooliganism motivated by religious hatred. Okay. Now, each member was sentenced to 2 years probation at the time.
Now, the reason this is a problem is that they were deemed specifically prisoners of conscience and eventually did receive support from the Amnesty International along with other human rights groups because of their situation.
Yeah, this situation gained additional notoriety during the imprisonment of Tolokonnikova and Alyakina. They were transferred to several prisons and eventually lost in the Russian prison system during their sentence.
Yikes. You do not want to be lost in the Russian prison system.
You don't want to be lost in any prison system, but especially
That's
the
true.
Russian prison system seems like a real problem.
Yeah, they have Demogorgon in there.
Yeah, ooh, no thanks, no thanks. They received death threats and were eventually sent to a penal colony where they were required to work 16-hour days and suffered from sleep deprivation.
They were released on December 23rd, 2013, just a few months prior to the 2014 Winter Olympics. And with respect to this issue, Tolkiennikova specifically stated, quote, "Releasing people just a few months before their term expires is a cosmetic measure that includes the case of Khodorkovsky, who didn't have much time left in his prison term. This is ridiculous. While Putin refuses to release those people who really needed it, it is a disgusting and cynical act," end quote. they were none too pleased with this move.
Nope, not at all. I mean, that's fair. I mean, you've got the Winter Olympics coming up, so they want to kind of like, there's a global image that has to be maintained. So it makes sense. Release some prisoners. Yeah. It's a good look. Oh, look, you're such a just government.
Yeah.
Now, Pussy Riot would go on to perform in protest of the Winter Olympics that year, where they were assaulted during the performance. So they are some of the bravest people on the planet, having just spent years lost in the Russian prison system, doing hard labor, suffering from sleep deprivation, and all the tortures that went along with it. And that's all well documented too. Like there's some stuff going on there. That's not. But the fact that they were like, we're out. Okay, good. Protest time, and they went and protested that. I thought that's really great. Like it just makes me respect them more.
Yep. All right. We do have one more because we're in that time here. So we have to speak about the one. This is former U.S. President Donald Trump. And if you are not familiar with the former President Donald Trump, he's a patsy. Just kidding. His trial was an enormous attack on democracy.
Yeah, we're just kidding. If he were charged with the crimes he's being indicted for, it's because he committed an actual well-established crime and not for his views. So let's talk about the insurrection, because I think this is something that people will twist the term prisoner of conscience and political prisoners around and try to make it something that it's actually not. So we're going to go ahead. Just bear with us on this. You might be familiar. You might have some emotional reactions to the January 6th insurrection, but we're going to go ahead and lay this out a little bit.
Yeah. And despite what you might think, Alan did not actually write this whole section.
Alan's a good model. I wrote this, so.
yeah. He may have inspired it, but but he didn't write it. Just, again, to be clear, we're kidding about
Donald Trump is not a political prisoner. We just want to be clear about that.
Enormous amounts of evidence to talk about. Okay, so January 6th, 2021, in the United States, there was an insurrection where our capital was attacked by citizens of the country. Many participants in the insurrection are beginning to claim that they are these political prisoners. And so that's why we're talking about it here. Specifically, they're claiming that because they have different views from like the mainstream United States government. So let's expound on this for just a second.
Yeah. So in the examples that we shared earlier of the actual political prisoners, all of those folks are arrested and charged with severe penalties for nonviolent actions, marches, protests, basic compliance with restrictive laws that were the most severe actions they took. So like they didn't really do anything that was dangerous or harmful or people getting murdered. They weren't involved in that stuff. And so they were arrested and they were charged for lifetimes, 15 years on house arrest, life in prison for stuff that they didn't do. And it was nonviolent. So just to refresh you on that.
Yeah, and some of it was stuff that they did do, but it was stuff that was like the worst offense on here was people being annoying. Like that was like the worst thing that any of them did. Most of them simply said something that the government didn't like. Some of them like refused to do anything, and some of them simply did a normal thing like drive a car, and that was seen as being inappropriate. And just to be clear, like we weren't talking about like drunk driving, like joyride through a market where a bunch of people were killed. It was literally just getting behind the wheel of the car and going from point A to point B at normal speeds. That was it. So we would understand if it had been like a car killing spree as why they're arrested, but that's not what happened here.
Right.
Again, going back to the insurrection, saw people who they broke into government buildings. 5 deaths were the result of this action directly as a result of the actions taken by the participants. The participants were not oppressed in this group context. So the power dynamic was not the same that we've seen in circumstances where the other political prisoners existed. Matter of fact, they were given the platform to protest and protest peacefully. What happened was it turned into breaking and entering and death.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a really important aspect that we want to talk about. This idea of a grievance population. A grievance population is usually an oppressed group that is actively protesting or speaking out against a tyrannical government. Here, this was not the context. This was not a context of an oppressed group. This group of people was not a grievance population. They were largely made up of white Americans, the group that represented the group in power and not a marginalized group. So a lot of the participants and the quote unquote activists that were at this event were part of a majority. They were part of people that were actively in government power. They were part of a larger group that was not marginalized. And I think that's a really important kind of piece to this.
Yeah.
In the cases that we talked about before, we were talking about military-run governments overpowering the majority, like we talked about with Myanmar. We're talking about racial segregation, like we saw with Mandela, with Gandhi, and with Martin Luther King. Restricted rights for women, like we talked about with al-Hathloul. And suppressed speech, which we talked about with Pussy Riot. So those are all examples of actual marginalization of groups, not you didn't win your contest.
Yeah, where it was the most privileged group with the most representation, and actually almost all of them had excessively over-representation based on the number of representatives that they receive in their constituent states that are relative to the actual number of people in their states.
Exactly.
And then there are people who are the oppressed groups who have zero representation, who were not part of this. You know, they're the ones who essentially are being targeted as by these groups who are claiming to be political prisoners.
100%.
Who definitely are not.
Exactly.
So those who want to claim that the arrests made during the insurrection were these politically motivated ones and that these are then therefore political prisoners, all you have to do is look at the charges. Remember earlier we mentioned the hooliganism as a charge? Nobody is being charged with hooliganism here. Here is what we've actually got as far as the charges for what actually took place, for which we have like just enormous amounts of video surveillance.
Right. So first is entering and remaining in a restricted building. These are government buildings that these people have broken into without permission. There's also disorderly and disruptive conduct in a restricted building. Again, it's a restricted building because it's a government building. And also violent entry and disorderly conduct in a Capitol building. These are where we're starting with some of these charges. And you can look this up. We'll include the link in the show notes so you can see what these charges are and who is being charged. Everybody is named. All their charges are clear.
There's also parading, demonstrating, or picketing in a Capitol building. So I think that's protected outside of a Capitol building, but not inside of a Capitol building. So having some, clearly defined lines of demarcation. Knowingly entering or remaining in any restricted building or grounds without lawful authority. That was definitely the case here. And obstruction of an official proceeding, which also was definitely part of, that was the intention. That was almost why they were there.
Yeah. There's also assaulting, resisting, or impeding certain officers. One of the officers ended up passing away as a result of this, right? Obstruction of law enforcement during civil disorder. Okay. Obstruction of justice or Congress. And that was a big part of that because it was confirming the election and they obstructed that.
Then we've got unlawful possession of a firearm on Capitol grounds or buildings. This isn't listed here, but also there was evidence of explosive devices found nearby and with other gear owned by the people who were there.
Right.
Theft of government property. We've got some images of that. Destruction or injury to buildings or property in special maritime and territorial jurisdiction. And finally, acts of physical violence on grounds. So although some of these, the charges are not all of these charges are explicitly violent charges, that all of them are laws that were written to specifically protect certain areas and proceedings and officials and people. And then there was also violence that was done.
And this is kind of the thing. Like when we talk about political prisoners, we have to kind of ask what the difference is with the charges for the people that are political prisoners and prisoners of conscience versus here. There's a wide valley between nonviolent strategies like marches, demonstrations, and protests compared to breaking and entering, assault, and theft. Okay, so when we talk about this stuff and when people talk about the insurrectionists being political prisoners, they're not being charged with being Republican or being conservative or wearing a red hat or hating religion or hating liberals. They're not being charged with that stuff. They're being charged with violent assaults on people. They're being charged with breaking and entering, with stealing stuff. Like those are the active charges that are in place. There is nothing on that list that I saw that was anything near politically motivated. And when you go through the entire list of charges for all of the people that are getting charged, none of them have anything to do with political motivation, have anything to do with freedom of speech, have anything to do with religious fanaticism, nothing like that. Nothing is in there like that. It's all stuff that we just talked about.
So sit on that for a minute while Johnson & Johnson sells you some shampoo. All right, so maybe you have some now Geico insurance, or maybe you have bought something from your local dispensary. We're going to get back to talking about going into a little bit more of the science and psychology of this, what's going on and why and that sort of thing. How does it work inside of political prisoners? So there's a few things to unpack.
So one of the things, and there's a lot of research on the difference between violent and nonviolent strategies when it comes to activism and protest. And so in cases where nonviolent strategies were used, tactics like disrupting systems, population dependence, work to disrupt what are called oppressive systems without harming people. And there are a lot of different case examples of that. We talked about a bunch of them earlier with the folks that were actual political prisoners. And these nonviolent strategies actually place protesters or demonstrators in harm's way. And we see that a lot. There is the risk of aversive control in those spaces, right? So if I'm protesting, then I'm going to have counter protesters that are going to be possibly violent towards me. And so those are things to be concerned about. We've seen this with actual political prisoners. We've seen that happen. But there is no direct action of violence toward the oppressor in non-violent strategies.
And going back to sort of what you were saying there is that in this country, we have very recently had a history of people who were simply protesting where they were then there was a violent counter-protest group that sort of went after them, right? And so essentially they're again like that violent counter-protest group are the ones who essentially caused the problem. They're the one, the non-violent group would be treated as political prisoners. And you can tell because their opposition is a violent group. And I think Charlottesville, North Carolina comes to mind immediately as a recent example of this.
Exactly.
Now, in cases where violence is used in demonstrations, it destabilizes and delegitimizes the movement. I mean, first of all, they generally have a value of nonviolence. Right? They generally are like, we don't believe that violence is an appropriate answer here. But they also, I think, understand in a somewhat savvy way that it delegitimizes their movement. If you start using violent strategies, you become the bad guy.
Right.
Like that just is what it is. And so this is why the only direction that we have, I think, moving forward has to be nonviolent. And no matter what side you're on, really, is that if you're going to make change, you will be in the wrong if you resolve to use violence.
Yeah, it'll work against your methods.
Yeah, exactly. And two case examples include the insurrection, which we were just talking about, and then the Black Lives Matter demonstrations that sometimes turned into riots. Although these are very, very different things, and that's what's really important to understand.
And I want to be really clear about this too, because I wrote these notes, and so like I don't want Abraham to deal with all this flack. But here's the thing: the reason I brought that up is because the riots themselves were the thing that helped, in the media at least, delegitimize a lot of the Black Lives Matter movements. Black Lives Matter movements are not violent movements. Yeah, they are non-violent. It's just that every now and again some bad apples get into it, and then in any protest that happens, that's true for anything. Yeah. In the riots themselves, it's the riot that itself that actually worked to create a narrative that caused a problem for the Black Lives Matter organizations.
Well, in Black Lives Matter, they specifically condemned the violence, which is another big distinction here between them and other groups, and the insurrection as being a really good example where not only have they not condemned the violence of January 6th from people who are like supporters on that side of things, they have either tried to downplay the severity of it, say it didn't happen at all, or just change the narrative completely. In the Black Lives Matter movement, instead what they did is they had to do damage control following this and to undo the damage caused by the protests, and explicitly say in every one of their subsequent demonstrations on their website, on social media, that they don't condone violence, they condemn the violence that was done, where it was done, and that they are only advocating nonviolent strategies. And we also do have, I mean, we talked about this when we talked in our protesting episode, but like there was actual demonstrations or some examples of people who like their job was to try and inflame things to get a riot happening.
Yes.
Right. Because they knew that doing that would delegitimize that movement and to make it look bad.
When you study provocateurs, that's exactly what they're designed to do. They're designed to show up and infiltrate groups, and they are designed to destabilize those groups through public means. Like that's what they're not saboteurs, right? They're provocateurs in that they are provoking other people to engage in these violent circumstances.
Yeah. And so for reference, refer to Strategic Nonviolence Power by Mark Mattiny. You've read this book, right? This is a new one?
I am still reading it. I'm like almost done with it, but it really does a really great job of explaining this in a really succinct way.
That's awesome.
But also giving a lot of other case examples about this. And it moves through all of the different nonviolent strategies and how they exist and how they work and whatnot.
Cool. So to be very, very clear, Black Lives Matter, if had they been imprisoned for those movements that were happening, that would have been political prisoners, people who were engaging in violent tactics in the insurrection, not political prisoners.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for clarifying that.
Just to be end on a very clear note there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, and just another clear note, we support Black Lives Matter. So
Yes, we do. Fact.
And now, another part of this is the idea of coercion. And so when we talk about political prisoners and imprisonment and prisoners of conscience, we have to talk about what coercion looks like. And oppressive governments will create a coercive environment for those who are oppressed or that grievance population. Ultimately, this leads to counter coercion. So somebody is being coerced, they will fight back, right?
Absolutely.
And kind of the metaphor I use is like a cornered rat will fight its way out. The more you close the walls in around it, the more you get closer, the more you trap them in, they will fight their way out. And so when coercion is present, people will push back, they'll speak out, they'll do all those things. And that is a lot of times where grievance populations and nonviolent strategies start to form, is in the presence of really coercive practices.
So arresting those who speak out, as that being the crime, is a form of coercion and is designed also to be a model. And so oppressive regimes use this as imagine they're saying this, right? Quote, see, this is what happens when you speak up, end quote. And that's not actually quoting anyone directly, but trying to put it in their voice. Yeah. So basically they often are like making examples out of those people to flex their power and demonstrate, and to maintain control because, they want people to be afraid of what will happen to them if they criticize or speak out against their overlords. Yeah. Poor Winston from 1984.
Oh, so sad. So sad. What a great book. Also a cautionary tale. Maybe more people should read it and then get that message that we shouldn't do that.
Right. Yeah.
Little things. Another thing to talk about within this from a scientific perspective is the idea of rewards for the political prisoners. Because when you think about it, it sounds like a lot of punishment and a lot of coercion is happening. And there's not a lot of like reward for these people who are like suffering from this, right? It's like 29 arrests, hard labor, getting lost in the gulags. Like none of that stuff sounds fun. So there's a lot of maybe anti-rewards here. And so based on what we've shared, it doesn't sound like there are a lot of rewards for those folks. It sounds like a lot of punishment, a lot of stress, and a lot of restriction for many of the people that are involved in these.
So why do people put themselves in these situations where they know that they can be arrested, they can be imprisoned, they could be tortured, they could even be killed, these situations? And essentially, I think it's really worth evaluating this from a values-based lens, that each of the cases above are people who were committed to living a valued life. They engaged in committed action toward things that they value, and that they were willing to be a sacrifice for other people to have the thing that they value moving forward. And that's what most of these people have been, is people who were willing to essentially put themselves through anything if that meant that they could create a pathway toward a better life for the other people around them. Yeah. And that's a huge sacrifice. Like, I think most people would be unwilling to go through something like torture in the event that they then might be guaranteed some freedom that there's no reason to believe they'll actually get as an outcome of their sacrifice. Many people died for something they believed in, and there was never any change that followed. And so it is a huge gamble, and it is very brave of them, and it sucks that people have to do that, I guess.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, it is a huge sacrifice. And, I imagine there is probably a great reward with the feeling of accomplishment that goes along with that, right? Like, there's got to be it's got to feel good to, like, get released from prison and then become the president of South Africa. Like, that had to have felt good for Nelson. Like, it's like, it was like vindicated, justified. Like, I am totally validated. But that doesn't always come for people. No. The reason that Nelson Mandela is a famous case is because of that really positive outcome. Right. There are times where people end up just dying. Yep. Or they just get tortured and nothing happens. I mean, like I said, poor Winston from 1984 is an example of that. Nothing changed. Yep. And he just got tortured and then reindoctrinated. So it's a really interesting thing when you talk about like the delays of reinforcement and the delays of reward that go along with these situations. And it has to be like an issue of grit and just perseverance and all of those things that go along with sticking it out for 30 years, 15 years in house arrest and all the things that happen.
Yeah. And it's very possible that many of them didn't think that the consequences would be as severe as they ended up being, but the government wanted to, as we've said, make an example out of them. But I think that generally they understand that there is a decent amount of risk that they're taking whenever they engage in these. And I think some of them are very clear on what's at stake when they do this. And I mean, even people who have some of those hunger strikes have resulted in people dying of their hunger, that the government or whoever lets them go to the point where they don't make it. And then like what happens, when the government's in control of the narrative, that story just doesn't get told.
Right.
And if it does get told, it's so far down the road that at that point it doesn't have very much effect, if any at all. And oftentimes they just are forgotten, and I think that happens, to continue to throw our own country under the bus. We have a whole island, or not an island, but like a whole location that we've essentially used to hold political prisoners.
Yeah.
Not exclusively. Like there are people there who have committed violent crimes, but there's a lot of people who have not.
Right.
And of course, I'm talking about Guantanamo Bay, which is egregiously illegal inside of our own government's laws and just continues to exist.
Yeah.
And is celebrated by some people as being a thing that violates our own constitution and human rights because they feel it's justified. And that to me is the horrifying reality.
Yeah. Also, thank you for bringing it up because we're recording on 9/11. So I'm glad that you brought that up today of all days. That's perfect.
That's a good point. Yeah, actually. Yeah.
I mean, because ultimately it's a ramification of 9/11. I mean, when you want to talk about political prisoners, I mean, so many people were imprisoned following 9/11 as a result of stuff like the Patriot Acts, which would imprison people for saying certain things or from being from certain countries. And that's how we ended up with Guantanamo Bay. That's how we ended up with internment camps during World War II. It's the same thing.
Right. Absolutely. So anyway, other countries do this a lot. Other countries do this even worse than the United States have. But I'm just saying our hands are not clean over here.
Yeah. It's important to recognize that.
Yeah. And that we can and should be doing better as a country. Obviously, I think there are many other examples of countries out there who are doing horrific things to themselves and neighboring countries. Putin, I'm looking at you. And so there's a lot that we could be doing better in this world. But I think just to going back to the main point of this, why do people political prisoner? Because they feel that their sacrifice is worth the potential outcome. Okay, so I like to think about this in the fact that why do the dictator governments tolerate these groups at all? Like why? Like the moment there's a whisper of dissent, why don't they quash that? In North Korea, they kind of do, but like in many other countries, like they are around. Like look at like Pussy Riot, for example. They weren't just gone the moment they said their first, what might be considered in Russia, seditious thing that they said, where they were simply protesting, that sort of thing. And I think it's because of recognizing that like first of all, we generally want to treat human beings as human beings. We value ourselves as a species. But I think from a purely political and economic standpoint, we need people around. Like if you imagine a government that actually systematically executed every single person who ever had anything bad to say about them, they would have like 100 people left.
Yeah.
Right? They would have no way of existing as a government. And that's kind of, I think, the big thing here is that like the reason we're a little bit shielded for those of us who are those, of us as humans who might choose to take on the mantle of something where they could end up a political prisoner is that they understand that you can't just go around killing people unless you're the Prince of Saudi Arabia. Right. Or the leader of North Korea. Yeah. And even then, like the community does frown on the overall world community does frown on this thing. And so like you are putting yourselves at risk, but also with the hope that humanity will stand behind you when you are trying to stand for humanity. And a lot of times they're right. And a lot of times they're wrong. But, generally saying that, like, I think that's part of what there is to understand about this is that like, we recognize that when we treat lives as mattering, as being important, then that gives an opportunity for a message to be heard. And when we treat lives as if they do not matter and are unimportant, then you're on the wrong side of history, basically, is how that goes.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
I think I can actually more or less wrap it up with that. And, I think we kind of said, I don't know. I love the idea of take home points and I feel like we always include them and I feel like they matter. And I feel like we've kind of reiterated our points so many times in this that we can hit them again, but I think we've more or less said them. So
No, I think so. I mean, I think at the end of the day, what matters is my biggest take home point in all of this is that it's important to have open dissent for a community to thrive, and communication and collaboration. And when you suppress a group that's not a utopian space, that's not a good place, and you should recognize that and recognize that we should probably move away from that.
Yeah. And I think I will end on, just because we made this point at the beginning, and I do want to make sure it's clear that with the definition of political prisoners, there are people who do things that could be violent, but they're also violent in a political way, and they end up being imprisoned. Mm-hmm. And I think it'd be hard for us to say they shouldn't be imprisoned if they were doing violence. Although there is definitions, there is fuzziness in there. And so the fuzziness becomes unclear. But most of the time when we're talking about political prisoners, I mean, particularly historically, but, also moving forward, we're talking about people who, as I said, the worst thing they did was be really annoying. Right. Many of them did nothing at all.
Exactly.
Let's talk about some things that we want to recommend after we hear some things that the algorithm in your feed recommends that you should buy instead. All right, I'm ready for some recommendations.
Let's do it.
Recommendations.
I am recommending a movie that I just watched that is on Netflix. It's got a crazy cast. So this movie is called The Devil All the Time. Mm-hmm. This has got Bill Skarsgård, Tom Holland, Sebastian Stan, Jason Clarke, Harry Melling, which many people will remember as Neville Longbottom from the Harry Potter movies, Robert Pattinson, Mia Wasikowska, Haley Bennett. People might remember from The Magnificent Seven or Girl on the Train, recently Cyrano and The Red Sea. It's also got Riley, I think it's pronounced Coe, maybe Keough, who was on Mad Max Fury Road, also on the new series called The Terminalist on Amazon Prime. She's on that. In Riverdale, so people might remember her from that. Okay. So just a totally stacked cast. I think, man, what to say about this movie? It's largely a period piece, and it is set in sort of, I think, the 1950s and 60s, if I remember correctly, in sort of rural US, sort of down south-ish area. And without giving too much away, let's just say it follows the story of a few people whose lives overlap, who mostly all do a bunch of terrible, terrible things.
Oh, okay. I like that. Yeah. I like movies like that.
Yeah. I think there's many sort of action pieces, and it's not an action movie really, but there's many sort of big confrontations that take place. So there's not leading up to a big climax and drop off. It's mostly a series of events that happen, but yeah, good movie. I'd recommend it.
Cool. I like that. I'm going to recommend a book if you're not the movie type. And the book is Noam Chomsky's On Anarchism. Now, hear me out, because I know what happens. For those of you who are behaviorists, you're going, excuse me, Noam Chomsky?
Yeah, how dare you?
The thing about Noam Chomsky is that, does his take on verbal behavior suck? For sure, it does. Yeah. But politically, he's actually pretty great. My introduction to Noam Chomsky was through punk and hardcore. It was never through behaviorism. Yeah. Most behaviorists get exposed to Noam Chomsky through behaviorism, and they have no idea that he was a political kind of commentary person before that. And so this book on anarchism came out in 2013 through the New Press publications. And it's a collection of his discussions and interviews around anarchy. And so it's really, really fascinating. The majority of the talks are very anti-capitalist. It's very the anti-work movement right now, which is cool. Yeah. He talks about how, wage slavery is a real problem, how the people should have the power in running and managing government and all that. And he's very, very, very left-leaning, very well-spoken about it. So despite the fact that he's not really great on understanding how verbal behavior works, the rest of the stuff is pretty good. And so I recommend just giving him a chance. Set aside your bias. Yeah. If you want to read some really cool political stuff, go give him a chance. And this is a really good place to start.
Yeah, don't read his linguist work. Read his political work.
Read his political work. For real, read his political work, because his political work is on point.
I've actually never read anything of his aside from his linguist stuff, but I did know that he had a lot of very interesting and thought-provoking political pieces that he had written I was not introduced to him that way as you were. And then did you ever see the movie Captain Fantastic where they celebrate Noam Chomsky Day?
No, I haven't seen that one.
Okay, that one, you might have fun with that one.
Okay.
But anyway, Noam Chomsky, and it was specifically because of his political beliefs. And I know a lot of people feel that way about him. So
cool.
I'd be interested in checking that out. I'd appreciate the recommendation.
Yeah, it's worth a shot.
Well, this has gone long. So if you'd like to tell us about a new movie or a book on anarchism that you enjoy, then you should reach out to us and let us know what those things are. We are super happy to hear from everybody. If you are a political prisoner or have been or know someone who is legitimately and is not someone who is doing violent crimes that are not in the minority, or I guess from the privileged group, and what I mean to say is no January 6th insurrectionists, please. But everyone else, if you want to reach out to us and talk to us, we are happy to hear your message, to spread it along and to share what you have to say, or at the very least read it and respond to you politely in email. You may reach out to us to tell us those stories on the social media platforms or email us directly at info@wwd.wwdpodcast.com. If you'd like to support us financially, you can join us over on Patreon. There you'll get access to a bunch of things like behind-the-scenes content, early releases of episodes, that sort of thing. If you don't want to join us on Patreon, you can go pick up some merch. As I said, you can take out a billboard in your area. We'll send you a logo you can use to post it up there.
Be great.
Happy to help with that. You can always just subscribe, leave us a rating and review, and go out and tell your friends. Maybe host like Why We Do What We Do block party, where you share us all with your neighbors, that sort of thing. Before I let everyone go, I definitely need to thank my team of people who helped make this podcast happen. That is Shane. Thank you so much for recording with me today.
Thank you.
And for your notes and work on this one. And we've also got Justin, Selena, Kyle, Alan, and Jess, and Patrick, who have recently joined the team. Thank you, team. And then, of course, for the people who help make this podcast happen, the people who have already joined us on Patreon and doing the good work. We've got Amanda, Brad, the Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kelly, Kim, Kostia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and Stephanie. You guys are the best. Thank you so much for your support.
For real. We love y'all.
Yeah. I think that is all that I have. Is there anything I'm missing or anything you'd like to add, Shane?
Nope, not today. I think that covers it.
All right, perfect. Then I think we're done. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.